Archaeologically, as we study these populations that begin to develop food production, we see some predictable changes that come out of it. Um, this transition from being a hunter gatherer to being a food producing society is really gradual at first until there are more states that kind of independently compete and conquer and such their neighbors. But once we shift the diet to cultivated crops, we see some predictable effects. One of those is population increase. Basically, diets that are heavier in grains lead to baby booms for a couple of reasons. One thing, and this is present even with the Mesolithic populations. Once you're no longer nomadic, once you develop sedentism, your work effort or your caloric expenditure is lower because you're not having to move your camp on a day to day basis, right? And so that in and of itself can lead to a baby boom because female fertility in what we call natural fertility populations, those that don't use any contraceptives or things like that. Female fertility is controlled by energetics. It's controlled by the energetics of pregnancy. It's controlled by lactation and this period of nursing, which are thusly kind of controlled by the growth demands of the child. So, in that context, where you reduce your energetic expenditure, you increase the free calories that you have that you can devote to reproduction. And so when populations settle down and start to live in villages, they see a birth boom. They see more um, more kids on average per family. So hunter gatherers have on average 4 to 6 offspring. Horticulturalists, which are populations that still like they cultivate garden plots, but they don't see kind of the same degree of social stratification. Horticultural populations have on average 8 to 10 offspring. And then when we get into these agricultural populations where we've got really kind of a sharp dichotomy between the different levels of social strata. And we see the need for people to work in the fields. We see these really, really big families. It's not unheard of for farming families to number up to about 14 or 16 offspring per couple. So the population increase stems partly from that and partly from the fact that grains are reliably easy early weaning foods. When we think about the foods that our babies in the United States are favored to eat as their first solids, by and large, it's cereal grains. It's rice cereal at 4 to 6 months, right? Rice cereal being chosen because it has fewer allergic responses. Probably not a good idea because it also is pretty high in arsenic, and arsenic's not really good for developing brains. But uh, that's still what the American Academy of Pediatrics proposes. Just as a side note, if any of you have plans on reproducing in the future and want to know what an evolutionary anthropologist would propose as the perfect first food, it's avocado. Babies' brains need to grow at phenomenal rates, and they need fats, healthy fats, to be able to do that. So, avocado is one of the best early foods, followed by probably egg yolk, not the egg white. The egg white, they're much more likely to have an allergic response. So, anyway, there's my little soapbox for a moment. So, we see a population increase from weaning foods as well because that relaxes the energetics on mothers because they're not having to provide all of the baby's caloric intake through breast milk. As populations increase, we see people start to move, we see migration. And this forces people then who live in other areas to start to respond by also beginning to cultivate, right? So in the hilly flanks, the people the Natufians came into contact with either had to adopt similar sorts of practices in the intentional cultivation of plants, or they had to move. and they would be outcompeted. So this leads to a rapid spread of agriculture throughout a region. By 7,000 years before presence in the Middle East, we had simple irrigation systems developed. These would tap into springs and use something kind of like our acequia system with the drainage ditches to move water. Um, by 6,000 years before present, we start to see complex irrigation systems. This allows agriculture to become possible in the southern arid lowlands. They were able to move water great distances. And these agricultural systems, I mean, we talk about the Roman aqueducts, but there are Middle East representations or representatives that are equally as complex as the famous or infamous Roman aqueducts. And then by about 5,500 years before present, we see a Mesopotamian state arise. We will talk towards the end of this lecture about um, how we define states, but states always have economic stratification. And so the Mesopotamian state was a state level society that had an economy that was based on irrigation and trade. It possessed a central government. It had extreme contrasts of wealth and social classes. And so we consider this distinct stratification. In other areas of the old world, we see farming rapidly spread as well. So the path from foraging to food production happened in 7 world areas, 3 that were in the New World or the Americas, and 4 in the Old World. And this happens through trade, through diffusion, and through migration, or spreads then through trade, diffusion, and migration. So the independent invention obviously does not involve the spread of food production, right? And so we don't see the independent invention spread through diffusion, right? But rather we see that we have the independent invention in these 7 world areas, and then the rapid spread of food production to other populations from those 7 world areas. And so this map shows you these areas of the world where food production was independently invented. So we've been talking about Mesopotamia. We have this belt across Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, that we call the Sahel. That area, so this would include like the Nile River Valley in Egypt, for example. Then we've got 2 regions in China, southern China and northern China, and these 3 areas in the Old World, including the southeastern United States, the highlands of Mesoamerica, and coastal Peru. In Africa, much of the archaeology has, of course, centered around Egypt and studying the areas in Egypt. Southern Egypt's Neolithic economy was incredibly complex, and we've been able to learn some things about their social system through these excavations. The first kind of hallmark of permanent settlements or sedentism in the Nabta occurred around 12,000 years before present. And in Egypt, we see the emergence of what we still refer to even in modern times of the African cattle complex. Cattle were by and large the predominant domesticated animal throughout much of Africa. And in this area of Africa, what we call the Sahel, that immediately to the south of the Sahara, we not only find farming communities, we also find the growth of what we term pastoralism. Pastoralism is defined as animal herding. And so that African cattle complex is still present in modern pastoral populations like the Maasai, like the Kipsigis, etc. So we have an early evidence of this African cattle complex. By 9,000 years before present, people were at Nabta year-round. And then around 7,500 years before present, right before that, there was a major drought that led to people abandoning the Nabta Playa. But by about 7,500 years before present, there were new settlers that occupied Nabta. bringing an incredibly sophisticated social and ceremonial system with like hallmarks of like pantheons of gods and such. So we often, we might consider saying that history in Egypt certainly starts with the Phoenicians, right? And that's true of quote unquote history because we define history as beginning once writing emerges. And of course, the hieroglyph systems of the Phoenicians are really well known because there's a lot of archaeological evidence of them, right? But there were complex social systems that were present even before what we term Phoenician society arose. In Europe, farmers migrated into southern Europe from areas in the Middle East. So around 8,500 years ago, communities from the circum-Mediterranean area began to spread crops and techniques across Europe. By 6,000 years before present, we have thousands of farming villages ranging from Russia to northern France. And once cultivation or food production takes hold in Europe, it spreads rapidly. And we're going to talk about a characteristic that contributes to the rapid spread of this new technology, and that is the major axes of the continents. And so, if you look at how land masses are oriented in Europe and Asia, it's in an east-west direction, which means that you can spread and stay at the same latitude. There are a lot of characteristics of the ecology of the environment, day length, growing season, rainfall, etc., that are dictated at least in part by latitude. And so, if we're able to spread technology across the same latitude, we don't have to do very much to change it. Africa and the Americas, by contrast, their orientation is mostly in a north-south direction. And so if you look back, if we go back to that map, right, that there's a reason why, even though early innovation of agriculture in Africa was around here, there's a reason why we've got a belt that expands in that east-west direction. And that is because it can rapidly spread as long as you're staying at the same latitude. So the same can't be said for areas in the New World. And so, um, in order for corn to be able to find its way into the North America, into the United States, for example, there have to be like basically there has to be like 3,000 years of genetic tinkering. There have to be a lot of changes bred into the crop before it's going to be able to be grown at farther northern latitudes. All right, in Asia, we've got a similarly early emergence of agriculture by 8,000 years before present. We've got domesticated goats, sheep, cattle, wheat, and barley in Pakistan. That comes not from the independent invention, but from the spread of people out of the Middle East, east into other areas of Asia. So when we think about the Harappan civilization, for example, the Code of Hammurabi, and the what we call Indus River Valley. That is an area that has early state emergence. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but it is not an area that has the independent invention of agriculture. So you might, at some point on an exam, see a multiple choice question that says, with respect to the independent invention of agriculture, which of these world areas does not belong? The correct answer in that context would be the Indus River Valley, because even though it's early for states, they had to borrow or steal, trade, and borrow to get the technology and knowledge that brings agriculture to India and Pakistan. China, though, is one of the areas with early farming. We have millet first domesticated around 10,000 years before present in northern China, and we have rice domesticated in southern China at about the same time. In China, we do have the early domestication of this animal here, which is called a water buffalo. And that is the water buffalo is a very critical component of rice farming in southern China. The buffalo not only pulls the plow, but also like their hooves are resistant to hoof rot, which like if we just took our cattle and plopped them down in areas that are heavy rice producing areas, we wouldn't be able to use our cattle to pull the plows because their hooves would end up rotting. So some unique biological adaptations for water buffalo to allow them to play such a critical role in rice farming. All right, so there are some key critical differences between domestication in the old world and domestication in the new world. First of all, in the old world, you have a coupling of the domestication of plants and the domestication of animals. At the same time that you're domesticating wheat, barley, millet, sorghum, rice, you're also domesticating sheep, goat, cattle, water buffalo, etc. Okay, that doesn't happen in the New World, and that is because large game animals weren't available to domesticate. Now, why weren't they available? Well, one reason is that in many cases we hunted them to extinction. So, as you think about wildlife in the old world versus new world, think about their evolutionary history. Okay. Hunted game in the old world evolved for millions of years side by side with humans, well, hundreds of thousands of years side by side with humans hunting them. So there's been selection pressure favoring animal populations that know how to be wary of humans and know how to evade predation. Okay, in the New World, that didn't happen. So when humans first moved into the New World about 20,000 years ago, it was like an all-you-can-eat Las Vegas buffet. Okay, these animals just stood there, kind of watching the humans while the humans cut them down. So we don't have that same innate, highly evolved fear of humans in old world megafauna that we saw in the new world. And that then translates into very easy overhunting of new world large game animals. Okay, so this was true of things like the giant ground sloth. We had camels in New Mexico, like camelids in New Mexico. This is true of the mastodon and mammoth populations that were here, right? Like, why is Elephant Butte called Elephant Butte? Because mastodons were there. This is true of the buffalo or bison. You know, it's bison antiquus is the prehistoric bison population that was hunted to extinction, even in places here like Folsom, New Mexico. So uh, you just didn't have that same option set of species to domesticate. So what animals were domesticated in the New World? Well, in Peru, we have guinea pigs. We also have llamas and alpacas. The llamas and alpacas were the largest ones domesticated. But I mean, I love the idea of pastoralism based on guinea pigs, right? Like the idea that you've got guinea pig ranchers out there rounding up with little chihuahuas, rounding up their herds of, I say little chihuahuas just because chihuahuas are small dogs, not because of any other association there, but herding their guinea pigs to follow some sort of migratory pathway. I think about a guinea pig dairy system where you've got little machinery to milk your guinea pigs and get teeny tiny buckets of guinea pig milk, right? I mean, it's nonsensical. It's farcical. We're not going to see a pastoralist economy based off of guinea pigs. Um, and so, even though guinea pigs were domesticated specifically for the purposes of eating, you're not able to base your whole economy off of domesticated guinea pigs. Interestingly, in this apocalyptic setting that we may or may not be finding ourselves in, right? If there ever is a zombie apocalypse, everybody should rush to the pet store to pick up a breeding pair of guinea pigs and rabbits. They will save your life in a zombie apocalypse because they're small. You can keep them inside. They don't necessarily make a whole lot of noise to attract the zombies, and they've got really high reproductive rates. So they would provide meat sources that would constantly replenish themselves. We also domesticated turkeys in the New World. That happened in the southeastern United States. Turkeys are notoriously ill-tempered, and the reproductive rate of most birds isn't going to sustain humans consuming those birds, right? Like we can get steady egg production from chickens and turkeys, right? But we and ducks too. but we don't get steady chick production. They're only going to have like one clutch of eggs a year. And so if we eat them, we're going to deplete their populations. All right, the three caloric staples that were domesticated by Native American farmers, both North and South America, include maize or corn, potatoes, manioc or cassava, and other crops like beans, squash, quinoa, goosefoot, marsh elder, and sunflower. So the three sisters that we in New Mexico know of maize, beans, and squash. This is the basics or the basis of what we call the Mesoamerican diet. So highlands of Mexico on up into the desert Southwest. And the idea behind the Three Sisters, of course, if you aren't familiar, I don't want a laser pointer, sorry. If you aren't familiar with it, right, you've got your corn stalk that grows up tall to the sun, right? And it has corn on top, but it also has corn in other areas. You plant your beans around the base and they kind of wrap and twine around the corn stalk. So the stalk provides them um, places to climb. And what the beans do, beans they're really good at nitrogen fixation. You need nitrogen in as a mineral for uh, growth of crops. It's really important for like this balance of leafy growth and also the fruit growth. And so planting plants that are nitrogen fixing means that their root systems have populations of microbes that develop a symbiotic relationship with them that provide them with a lot of nitrogen. And that then fertilizes the soil for everything growing in that same plot. So it's one reason why they might be planted as like a cover crop during non-growing seasons, right? Like overwintering or something like that. But it's also why they do so well when planted with other crops. And then you plant your squash plants, and the squash plants have these don't look really like squash leaves, but the squash plants can also climb the stalk, and they produce these large shade producing leaves that then kind of lower the temperature in that immediate area so that water doesn't evaporate as fast. So the squash is able to help the soil and thusly all of the plants to retain their moisture for longer. So the Three Sisters are um, incredibly like adapted for this desert climate. All right, so this is a picture that shows manioc or cassava. And it's been domesticated throughout South America. It's a caloric staple throughout the tropics. And this particular woman is actually from Ghana. So, as we domesticated crops in both the Old and New World, and then we have periods of contact that were really driven by colonialism, right? By European conquest, we see the spread of crops. And so manioc has reached much of Africa and Southeast Asia and has become a staple crop there, just like corn has, just like potatoes made it to Ireland, etc. One interesting thing about potatoes, there is a specific kind of potato that's grown in our region called the Four Corners potato, which is about the size of a marble. They're actually really, really small potatoes that um, some of the university, I can't remember whether it's University of Utah or Utah State. One of them has a program where they're trying to kind of resurrect the Four Corners potato, trying to get it out there and marketed and then incorporated back into indigenous cuisine because it was one of the staples of the ancestral Puebloans as they settled in the Four Corners area. All right, so in the New World, we've got food production in Mesoamerica, including Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize. We've also got food production independently invented in the eastern United States and in the south central Andes. So in South America, food production or farming began in lowland areas and then spread into Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean islands. We've got squash seeds from Peru that date back to at least 10,000 years, and they are fully domesticated squash seeds, meaning that it's not like 10,000 years ago wasn't the first attempt at intentionally planting squash, but rather there'd already been enough selection um, on those squash plants, so they were already considered fully domesticated. By 9,000 and 8,000 years before present, farmers were selecting certain characteristics in their cultivated plants, and by 7,000 years, had started to expand plots into nearby forest, clearing and using slashing and burn techniques. Okay, so of course, one of the biggest crops that all of the New World relied on, and the crop that basically was a limiting factor in the spread, development and spread of New World states is corn or maize. Maize domestication took place in the lowlands of southwestern Mexico. The ancestor of maize is teosinte. This is what it looks like. It's a wild grass, and that is the seed head. This is what was developed then into the ears of corn. It took a long time, and so really in the period between roughly 12,000 and um, 7 or 6,000 years before present, populations were certainly working on domestication, but that wasn't the bulk of their diet. And so, as we look at coastal Peru, as we look at the highlands of Mexico, we find that the earliest crops that were domesticated were crops that served a purpose for some other reason. So, those squash seeds that we were talking about, there are areas in the mountains of coastal Peru where those squash are, I mean, they're kind of akin to our bottleneck gourds. Those squash were specifically harvested to provide vessels for carrying things, water being one of those things. And so, coastal Peru, much of it's a desert, and those bottle squash were specifically important to be able to allow people to hunt and gather and cover these larger distances, but still have fresh water on hand that they could drink. And so many of these early plants that were domesticated weren't domesticated and to be able to be, or were not candidates for developing a large carbohydrate staple, right? And so this is why state formation in the New World happens at a slower pace than state formation in the Old World, because we didn't have a carbohydrate staple until corn domestication was completed, and that took 3,000 years. So by about 7,300 years before present, maize spreads to the Mexican Gulf Coast. In these highlands of New Mexico, right, we had hunting as a very important part of broad spectrum foraging. Those hunting, those animals that were hunted were mostly small game, and specifically in the Mexico highlands in the Oaxaca area, we've got groups that hunted and gathered in the fall and winter, and then in the spring and summer they would come together to harvest seasonally available plants. And so it's not quite central place foraging in the sense that you don't have a single year-round village, but it is central place foraging in the sense that you've got basically your summer village and your winter village. And so, this is certainly typical of many native populations throughout the United States, not just in the desert Southwest, right? You go up into the mountains during the summer, you come down from the mountains during the winter. These seasonal movements between winter and summer camps are not unusual. So by 4,000 years, so the main gathered plant that was kind of competing with maize was mesquite, the harvesting of mesquite pods. So it wasn't until 4,000 years before present that we finally had bred enough changes into corn that it would provide more food than mesquite pods. So we started breeding it in 7,300 years before present, and it wasn't until 4,000 years that it was productive enough. And so as soon as maize became productive enough, by 3,500 years before present, we've got permanent villages. We've got the rise of what we term chiefdoms and then early states.